John chapter 9 is where we want to be this morning. And we began last week by saying that there is nothing more crucial, nothing more essential, nothing more critical and urgent than being reconciled with God, than our relationship with the Lord being restored. Because only through Jesus Christ, so only in God, we have life, especially now as we go through this uncertain and unstable times. Last week we have looked at how Jesus addressed the problem of shallow Christianity, or in other words, nominal Christianity, by presenting himself as the bread of life, that you must eat his body that is offered on the cross so that we may have life and have true satisfaction. Because only Jesus can truly satisfy and make our souls live. So that's where we are this morning. And today's text, God is addressing another serious spiritual problem. So if last week, if Jesus addressed the shallowness of our Christianity, when God challenged them to become more serious, instead of just following Jesus for the bread that they eat, God has challenged them, you have to eat my flesh and drink my blood, which he meant by his death on the cross. Unless you eat from me, you will not live. God is addressing another serious spiritual problem, and that is the problem of Christian hypocrisy, also known as spiritual blindness. So let's read our text this morning, John chapter 9, verses 1 through 5. So think about the symbolism of Jesus' healing here, and think about what he is getting into, the real problem of spiritual hypocrisy. Let me read to you from the ESV. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth. And his disciples asked him, Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? Jesus answered, it was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming, when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world. This is the word of God. Amen. So last week, Jesus presented himself. So we're going through the series of I Am. There are many accounts of what God is and who God is in the Bible, but a lot of them are through the eyes of the prophet, or through the people, through the kings and through the scribes. And they present God as what they see, how God has revealed to them through the scriptures. But this time, this series, I Am, Jesus is addressing himself. Jesus is presenting himself as, I am this, I am that. So it takes much more weight. Right? It is more clear in God showing himself through his own very words. And Jesus is saying, I am this. So he wants to be known. And last week we have seen him as, I am the bread of life. So God offers himself as the bread that can give life and that can only satisfy our hearts and our souls. And this week, through our text, we saw that God is presenting himself. God is revealing himself as what? The light of the world. So the problem that he is addressing is hypocrisy. So how is hypocrisy defined? I looked it up, and this is how it's defined. The practice of claiming to have moral standards or beliefs to which one's own behavior does not conform. So in other words, you are not walking what you're talking. You're full of head knowledge, but there is the lack of heart connection. But there's more to that than just not having the talk to what you walk. Like shallow Christianity, hypocritical Christianity is not only lifeless, But when you think about it, it is very, very deadly in a sense. That is why it is ever so serious. And Jesus is addressing this very problem, this very spiritual problem that was prevalent in that time. And he is addressing the same to us this morning. Are you a Christian who is quicker to judge others than yourselves? Do you find it easier to get Christian information than practicing them? Do you find it harder to forgive and to love? If you have answered yes to any of those, you may be showing signs of Christian hypocrisy or spiritual blindness. And it is my prayer that God opens up our spiritual eyes this morning through John chapter 9 and illuminate into our hearts the true light of Jesus Christ, the truth that we see in Him. The funny thing is that Jesus is addressing this very problem, the spiritual blindness or spiritual hypocrisy, 2,000 of years ago. But He is addressing the same problem today into our hearts as well. So let's look at verse 1. Jesus encounters this man born blind. However, in dealing with him, we find that God is doing more than just curing of this incurable disease. We see Jesus, He's reaching in further. He is chasing after something that is deeper and something that is more serious than the physical blindness of this man. He is addressing the spiritual blindness of Israel. So keep in mind this contrast. This physical blindness versus the spiritual blindness of Israel. The setting is so fascinating to me. When you read these stories, Jesus very particularly finds Himself in a certain setting and uses that setting to really address the problem that they're having. And the setting is this. John sets the scene up very clearly, which begins in chapter 7. So if you read chapter 7, we know that the Israelites are in this festival called the Feast of Booths, or the Feast of Tabernacles. So this is a week-long festival in October where they celebrate near harvest. So think of it as an American Thanksgiving season. They celebrate, and they call it the Festival of Tabernacles or tents or booths because they want to commemorate their time of Exodus in the leadership of Moses. So when Israelite exited the slavery in Egypt, they lived in tents for 40 years, wandering in the wilderness. So this is the festival, a week-long festival with lots of food and lots of celebration, commemorating their historic journey that they took with Moses through the wilderness. And they would build themselves an actual tent. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Jewish holidays, but they would build a tabernacle, a little tent. In our apartment a couple of months ago, I found a family. They built a little tent in their balcony. And I'm sure they were celebrating that. And then after a week, they removed that tent. So Jews are very big in this celebration because Exodus was a major, major deal in their history. So they would eat, the food of that time, and they would sleep in the tents just to relive the history and relive this great redemption of Moses through this season. And then each night, there was a great ceremony called the illumination of the temple, or the Festival of Light. So imagine, every night during this season, they would light up 4 giant golden lamps in the temple yard. They're about 75 feet high. And they would light it up every night, and they call it the illumination of the temple or the Festival of Light, symbolizing what? A pillar of fire that has guided them through the wilderness. So every night they would be reminded of that time. So it's a big deal. Israelites were in their festive spirits. However, do you see the irony here? So as they're celebrating the lights, God is addressing their spiritual blindness. And not only there's irony here, you can also see the agony of Jesus Christ. He's saying, you know what? You have all the lights that you need. to be in the right place with God. You have the scriptures. Israelites were the only ones with the scriptures, and they were the only chosen people by God, and they had the temple of God, and they were given the office of the priests, and God has sent them numerous prophets. So they had all the life that they needed to be in the right place with God. However, they were blind. And Jesus is addressing all of this, in all of this tradition, in all of these festivals, you must address that you are living in darkness because you don't have the light. So you see, Jesus sees this man born blind, and he heals him to address the serious corruption of Israel. And God wanted to restore. So what is the problem? So why is this spiritual blindness so dangerous? So as the story progresses, you can see 3 levels of dangers of spiritual blindness, or this spiritual hypocrisy that the Israelites were blinded by. And Jesus exposes all of them through their encounter with the disciples and the parents of this blind man and the Pharisees. And we're going to look at all of them. So number 1, what are the 3 dangers of this spiritual blindness? 1 is that if you're spiritually blind, this blindness causes judgment of others and self-righteousness. And number 2, it runs in fear. Fear will be the driving force. And it becomes very, very abusive to others. So let's tackle one by one. In verse 1, look at the disciples' question. Verse number 2, it says, "And his disciples asked Jesus, 'Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?'" So I say innocently asked because it was not uncommon in ancient Israel or ancient Judaism to associate certain persons' disability or tragedy to a personal sin. I mean, generally speaking, it is not altogether wrong. Because all the suffering that we have in this world is because of the fall of man. Right? All the pain and all the diseases and all the unfortunate events are because of sin that happens in the world. So they're not altogether wrong to ask this question. However, to generalize by tying every suffering to a specific or personal sin is not only unwarranted, but it is unbiblical and even anti-gospel, deeply rooted in self-righteousness. I mean, you have to think about it. Yes, sufferings sometimes do come from people's sins, right? Drunken driving will cause you serious life-altering injuries or even life-ending fatalities. Overdose of drugs will cause a lot of the pain and suffering. However, to generalize every disability or every unfortunate events to a personal sin is in fact very, very unbiblical and anti-gospel. And this is the reason why. So they find a blind person and they ask this question: whose sin resulted in that man's blindness? Is it his sins or his parents' sins? By you asking that question, you're subconsciously thinking that he or his family is spiritually inferior because of their suffering. And vice versa, because they have sinned much, they're suffering much. And vice versa, because you're not suffering, what do you automatically assume? That you are okay, that you are doing something right in the Lord, that you are in a better position than they are. So immediately this spiritual blindness causes judgment of others. And it is a serious danger because it cripples that person. So can you imagine being born blind and the whole society thinks that it's because someone sinned in your family? So maybe your parents had committed this serious problem or this serious sin. Or maybe it's because of your sin while you were in your mother's womb. that you're born sinful, that you're born blind. It becomes a very, very crippling danger for this family. And then Jesus answers, verse 3, "It is not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." So Jesus immediately discredits their question and says, you know what, it is not because of the certain sin that they have committed, but because God has a bigger plan. God has a greater purpose in this man through this blindness. And we're going to see what happens here. And then later, Jesus healed this man. So before healing, Jesus says, you know what? I am the light of the world. And then you will see why. And then by that proclamation, after that proclamation, Jesus spits on the ground and makes mud with his saliva. And he anoints that and applies it in that man's eyes. And then he says, go wash in the pool of Siloam. And then he went and he washed. And then verse 7 says, he came back seeing. So once he is healed, the Pharisees begin to question their neighbors and their parents. So you see, let's look at their interaction with their parents. Verse 8 here. Neighbors and those who had seen him before as a beggar were saying, is this not the man who used to sit and beg? Some said, it is he. Others said, no, it is not. So they're immediately arguing amongst themselves because they're not sure if that was the real blind person or not, because this is a miraculous healing. No one knows. And then the Pharisees, verse 13, they brought to the Pharisees the man who had formerly been blind. And then it says here, now it was a Sabbath day that Jesus made the mud and opened his eyes. So the Pharisees began to ask him how he had received his sight. And he said to them, he put mud on my eyes and I washed and I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, for he does not keep Sabbath. But others said, how can a man who is a sinner do such signs? And there was a division among them. So again, immediately there's division and there's arguments. And immediately they find themselves divided because they're unsure of how this had happened. And then they call the parents. Look at verse 18. The Jews did not believe that he had been blind and had received his sight until they called the parents of the man who had received his sight. So they said, you know what? No one can believe. No one can be certain that this man was truly, in fact, the blind man that was healed. So they call on the parents and ask them, is this your son who you say was born blind? How then does he now see? His parents answered, we know that this is our son and that he was born blind. But how he now sees, we do not know. Nor we know who opened his eyes. Ask him, for he is of age. He will speak for himself. And then there's a little explanation here. His parents said these things because they feared the Jews. For the Jews had already agreed that if anyone should confess Jesus to be Christ, he was to be put out of the synagogue. And the parents said, he is of age, ask him. So another danger of this spiritual blindness or this spiritual hypocrisy is not only it leads to judging others, not only it leads to dividing others, it drives the people to fear. The parents knew the answer. The parents knew that it was Jesus who has healed them. But they couldn't say the truth because they were fearful of their excommunication from the synagogue and from society. And at that time, for them to be excluded in the synagogue means to be excluded in society. So everything that they did was out of fear. And in fact, when you think about it, the Pharisees also did all of that out of fear also. Because they didn't want their position to be threatened by another Messiah, another Christ. So you see, the whole society is driven by fear. And they're dividing one another. Because why? They're all living a life of spiritual hypocrisy. They say one thing, but they don't live out what they say, what they believe. is not lived out in their lives. Nothing is being practiced. It's very, very separate Christianity. And not only that, it leads to abuse. Look at how the Pharisees now deal with this blind person. Look at verse 24. So for the second time they call that blind man up. And they say to him, "Give glory to God. We know that this man is a sinner." Verse 25. He answered, "Whether he is a sinner, I do not know. But one thing I do know, that though I was blind, now I see." They said to him, What did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered them, I've told you already, and you would not listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you also want to become his disciple? And they reviled him, saying, "You are his disciple, but we are disciples of Moses. We know that God has spoken to Moses, but for this man, we do not know where he comes from." And the man answered, "Why, this man is amazing. Why, this is an amazing thing. You do not know where he comes from, and yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners, but if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, God listens to him." And listen to what the Pharisees say. "Never since the world began, it has been heard that anyone opened the eyes of the man blind." Verse 33, "If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." And they answered him, "You were born in utter sin, and you would teach us?" And they cast him out. So for this blind man, he cannot tell a lie because he is so gripped by what he has experienced in Jesus Christ. He was sure of who God was. He was sure how he was healed. And he is arguing with the authorities of that time. And he's saying, "You know what? Why do you keep asking me the same question? Do you also want to be Jesus' disciple? Is that why you're asking me?" And the Pharisees are saying, "No, we're not his disciple. We're the disciple of Moses," calling back to the traditions and calling back to all of their history as a Jew. And then they said this in verse 34. "You were born in utter sin. And why are you teaching us?" And then they cast him out. I love the NIV translation. NIV translation said this: "You were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us?" And then they threw him out. So this spiritual blindness, this spiritual hypocrisy, the whole society was all about believing in God, saying all the right things, and yet their hearts were so distant from the Lord. They practiced all the things that the law had commanded them to do. They were living in this festive time. They had the tent set up. They're eating nice food, and they went to these celebrations of lights, and yet their hearts were never there. And they've been doing that for many, many hundreds of years. And the result of it, the whole society was full of judgment, full of division, full of fear, and full of abuse. Abuse like this, where Pharisees hurl verbal insults, verbal abuse, saying, "You were born in utter sin. The moment you were born, you were just messed up. And how dare you lecture me? How dare you lecture us, someone who is different than you?" Then how then does Jesus point out this serious spiritual blindness? This society was so blinded that they're driving the whole society into darkness. And how does God address this problem? By dealing with this blind man's blindness. So in contrary, let's look at this blind man. How does he respond to those dangers of spiritual blindness? Number one, he was not judgmental. Or he was not self-righteous either, because he contributed nothing to his healing. There was nothing that he could boast of. When you look at verse 1, it wasn't even the blind man who found Jesus. It was Jesus who found the blind man. I mean, obviously he can't see Jesus because he was blind. So Jesus finds him first. Jesus sees him first. And then Jesus heals him with his power. With the mud and with the saliva and with him obeying the word of God to go wash in the pool of Siloam. That's how he has received his healing. And this is the heart of the gospel. While we were yet sinners, while we were utterly helpless, God has found us first. And there was nothing for him to boast anymore other than the one who has healed him. Big contrast to the whole society. They have so much to boast. They have so much to judge. They have so much to look down on people who are suffering because they have their self-righteousness to boast in. Secondly, this man was not bound by fear. While the parents couldn't speak the truth in fear, this man spoke boldly against the Pharisees, even to a point where he was kicked out of the society. And then thirdly, he was not abusive. We see no records of any retaliation, even when he was kicked out. Do you see the contrast here? Physically blind is now seeing. And seeing people are now becoming blind. And what is the one that sets those two apart? There's one hinge. There's one point that differentiates the two. Have you played with magnifying glass as a kid? I remember I have. When I was in school, someone brought a magnifying glass to school. I was in elementary school in Korea. And then we would all go outside and we would look at things, magnify. And then this guy would focus the light into one spot and they would kill the ants. Poor innocent ants. And they would burn it to death. And then I remember they were burning each other's back of their hands too. So I said, oh yeah, me too. I want to do mine. Do me. And then I had that one spot too. It's like this. The whole light of the world, Jesus Christ, is honing into this one focal point. All of the darkness, all of the light that God brings through creation, all the glory that is revealed in the universe is honed into this one spot. And when all of the light becomes concentrated, there's heat and it burns. And it ignites. And that point, that focal point is your view of Jesus Christ. And that is why it is so important for us to see God as I am. Because how we experience God may be different. But this is Jesus expressing himself to us as I am. And it cannot be more clear than this. And he's saying, I am the light of the world. Focus everything onto me. And there will be heat, there will be fire, and it will light up. The blind was so sure of who Jesus was. Look at verse 33. He says this, if this man were not from God, he could do nothing. But look, he did what no man could do. So he must be someone of God. And then he says he's like a prophet. And that was the highest compliment that he could give. But later, Jesus illuminates more light unto him. He shows himself more and more to him. Later, he reveals himself as the Son of Man. Look at verse 35. Jesus heard that they have cast him out. So this blind man now seeing was cast out by those people. He now no longer can live in the city. But what happens? Jesus finds him. Verse 35, and having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to him, you have seen him. That's the title of our sermon. This is the focal point. All the glories of God concentrated in this one phrase. You have now seen him. So Jesus causes man to now see. He was blind all his life, but now he is seeing. But once he sees, Jesus wants him to see what? Clearly. He wants to see him. He didn't just heal him so that he could just explore the world and see all the things that he has imagined while he was blind, but he wants that man to now see him. And look what happens once he sees him. You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. And he said, Lord, I believe. And he worshipped him. This is where we need to be. This is the one hinge that differentiates the group of people with all of their lights, all the lights that God has given them, and yet blinded. But versus this man who was born blind all his life, but now he finally sees. And the whole difference happens because this man now sees Jesus clearly, and the rest do not. Where do you fall? How clearly do you see Jesus? Who is Jesus to you? I'm not talking about your head knowledge. I'm not talking about how much you know of Jesus Christ. But I'm asking, how clear is he to you in your life? How visible is he in your daily walk with the Lord? How is it that you are walking with him every day? As you're dealing with work, family, studies, careers. Is he there? Do you see him clearly in your homes and in your workplaces? In your studies, do you see him there, or are you blinded like the rest of the group? You'll be in a dangerous place to say that you know God, but don't see him clearly. Just because you're a Christian, or that you have been a Christian all your life, just like myself, just because you're here worshiping with us this morning, does not automatically make you a true worshiper like the man. But you must remember the Pharisees and the other Jews were very, very religious. They were all about keeping the law. They were all about doing all the right things, and yet they had no Jesus in their heart. But it was their lack of seeing Jesus as the culmination of the law and prophets that they have slowly become dangerous, spiritually blind, spiritually hypocritical. They were relying on the rituals, the tabernacles, the candle posts, but they failed to truly see God in their temples. They failed to see God as the light that they needed. That is why Jesus, at the expense of ripping up his body on the cross, what did he do to the veil in the temple? He has torn that veil so that the light of God can now see through that curtain that once divided man and God. That ritual that no one can cross. Jesus himself became the sacrifice on the cross, and he has torn himself off so that the light of God can shine through and focus in that Jesus Christ, in the person of Jesus Christ, and ignite a fire. Not a physical candlelight 75 feet high that needed to remind people, but the light in their hearts. To see God clearly as the only one who can save. To see God as the bread of life. The only one that we need to eat from to have life. Jesus wanted one thing from the Israelites, and that is for them to see him clearly as Lord. Just like this blind man, now seeing man, confessed, Lord, I believe, and he worshipped him. And that is a blessing. To be able to have Jesus Christ as the light of the world is a blessing because we can see everything else clearly through him as well. I love how C.S. Lewis put it. In a succinct quote, this is what he said. I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else. Right? Not when you have Jesus Christ as a light, not only it's a joyful thing because we see God clearly now, but through that light, we can see everything else clearly now because we have the light. When we look at the world, We have many lenses that we see the world through. It could be politics, it could be economics, it could be your career, it could be your relationships, it could be all the baggages of your past. That we can't see the world clearly. Everything seems broken. But when you see through the clear light of Jesus Christ, as a sovereign God, as a good God, as a gracious God, as a God who loves to save, even at the expense of killing His own Son to save you, we will see the world clearly. And we will be able to live a life of peace and of joy. So we must fix our eyes on Jesus as the light. Let that light break through that darkness. As we go through this dark world, it seems it's getting darker every day. We must find God as the light of the world. And we must press on that light will break through. Just like the author of Hebrews 12 said this, let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before Him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So he's saying, Jesus did that too. As He was hung on the cross, all His body is ripped up. As He was dying a brutal death, He saw light in God. And He didn't give up. He didn't despair. But He saw the joy that was behind the cross. And He delighted that in obedience. Dear brothers and sisters, do not be blinded by just going through the motions here. This will only get us nowhere. But we must be able to see God clearly in our hearts and in our daily lives. Through the Word, we must have a relationship with Him. Through seeing other people, we must encounter how God sees those people too. As much as we disagree with other people, as much as we hate, or as much as we cannot agree with certain things, we must see them through the eyes of God. In love, in forgiveness, and in grace. And I want to end with this point. There's a sense of urgency. There's a sense of urgency. Let's look at verse 4. We kind of skipped through this because I wanted to leave this for the last point here. Look at verse 4. This is Jesus saying, as the disciples were questioning the blindness of this blind person, this is what Jesus said. We must work the works of Him who sent me while it is day. Because night is coming when no one can work. He's saying, you know what? Night is coming when no one can work anymore. And while you have the light, you must live. You must do the works of God. So Jesus is inviting all of us to join in His work. In Jesus being the light of the world. Because the night is coming, and night is a place where it is absent of Jesus as the light. And when Jesus is not there, this night becomes a place of absolute hopelessness. Absolute darkness. And there are many people who are living in this night. Absolute hopelessness. And there is nothing for them to see forward. And Jesus calls them, night is coming when no one can work. And while it is day, while you have me, the light of the world, do the works together. The works of God so that we may all see. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. It's a book titled Night by Elie Wiesel. It's a famous book because many of you study at school. I don't know if you study here in Arizona. It's one of the required readings. Elie Wiesel is a man who lived through the Nazi concentration camps. And he experienced the greatest evil a man can experience in the concentration camps. And we find himself losing faith in God because he loses his family members in gas chambers. And no one has gone through the darkest nights like this man. I mean, we're all going through one our own. But this is what he says. Never shall I forget the night, the first night in camp that turned my life into one long night, 7 times sealed. Never shall I forget the smoke. Never shall I forget the small faces of children whose bodies I saw transformed into smoke under a silent sky. Never shall I forget those flames that consume my faith forever. Never shall I forget the nocturnal silence that deprived me for all eternity of the desire to live. Never shall I forget those moments that murdered my God and my soul and turned my dreams to ashes. Never shall I forget those things, even when I condemned to live as long as God himself. Never. Can you sense the darkness that he was in? Although he didn't completely lose his faith, although later he did recover, this is the kind of night that God is speaking of. When we go through this night, there is no light and there is no hope. But there are other people who has gone through the same things and said the different things. In that deepest night of utter evil, can we say it is well? The person who wrote this beautiful hymn, It Is Well, Horatio Spafford, after losing all of his possession in the fire, after losing all of his daughters in a shipwreck, he penned these beautiful words. Though trials should come, let this blessed assurance control that Christ has regarded my helpless estate and has shed his own blood for my soul. It is well. And then Corrie ten Boom, who's also gone through the concentration camp and has lost her sister, said this, and that quote is also found in the bulletin here. If you look at the world, you will be distressed. If you look within, you will be depressed. But if you look at Christ, you will be at rest. Same things they have experienced. One almost lost the faith, but the other came out seeing Christ as their ultimate Savior, ultimate hope and joy. And it is my prayer that whatever that we go through, as we have Jesus Christ as our light of this world, that not only we will see the world clearly, but we will live it. We will live with him so that whatever night we experience, we will have the light and we will do the works of God so that all those who are living in the night will come to the light because of you. Let's all bow our eyes and pray.